the idea that all behavior originates in the brain and how brain differences resulting from genetics or environment can affect the way they respond to drugs and whether or not they become addicted.
Food Addiction is a podcast which explores the disease of food addiction and presents the solution. We interview professionals and counselors who specialize in the disease of food addiction, and we interview individuals who have successfully recovered from food addiction and discuss how they did it. Esther Helga Goodmans-Dotier was motivated to change careers after she recovered from food addiction by opening a food addiction treatment center and the InFact School, the world's first and only sugar and food addiction counseling training, which offers a recognized certification. Check out the website for more information on obtaining this certification, as well as proven recovery programs at infactschool.com. Listen to these episodes as we discuss the problem and the solution around food addiction. I'm Susan Branscombe. I am a recovered food addict and the host of this podcast, Food Addiction, the Problem and the Solution. Today on the podcast, we have Dr. Bonnie Nolan. Welcome, Bonnie.
Thank you, Susan. Happy to be here.
Good. I'm glad to have you. Bonnie and I both serve on the board of Food Addiction Institute, and the website is foodaddictioninstitute.org. The Food Addiction Institute was founded in 2005. It's a nonprofit organization whose mission is to raise public awareness and offer education about food addiction as a substance use disorder, which is aligned with making sure food addiction is a substance use disorder and makes its way into the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-5 as a recognized substance use disorder. The Food Addiction Institute also supports availability of treatment for food addiction recovery. So I'm happy to be serving with you on the FAI board.
It's a great organization. Thank you.
Yeah. Going to introduce you, and then we'll get to some questions. Bonnie Nolan has a PhD in neuroscience and has the LCADC designation, which stands for Licensed Clinical Alcohol and Drug Counselor. She is an addiction services consultant, and Dr. Nolan received her undergraduate and graduate degrees from Rutgers University and the University of Medicine and Dentistry at Rutgers. Dr. Nolan taught at Rutgers for almost 10 years before opening and operating a successful outpatient center for treatment of all substance use disorders. In 2016, she created the Addiction Services Division of Woodbridge Township Health Department in New Jersey. The program is an opioid overdose recovery program wherein peer recovery coaches visit overdose victims as soon as they arrive in the hospital. The program also organizes community programs for prevention, intervention, treatment, and recovery from substance use disorders. Dr. Bonnie Nolan is currently in private practice as a licensed clinical alcohol and drug and food counselor with Nolan Center for Behavioral Health, and her company serves as a mental health consultant to Woodbridge Township in Middlesex County in New Jersey. So welcome again, Dr. Bonnie Nolan.
Thank you, Susan.
Great. We'll get into some questions, and I've got a good episode here ahead of us. Let's start by talking about your educational background, your experience, kind of what you do and where you focus.
Great. Sure. Yes. I became interested in neuroscience in general when I took a course. I thought I was going to get out of college and that would be the end of it. But I already had kids. I was very busy, but I took a class called behavioral pharmacology. And suddenly in my last year of college, I was absolutely hooked. I was really interested in the way the brain responded to substances, and just the idea that all behavior originates in the brain was fascinating to me. And I could actually sort of see the mechanism behind that. So that professor fortunately invited me to join his lab as a graduate student in the field of neuroscience. So I worked for a long time in studying substances in animal models, studying their behavior, and also worked in collaboration with other labs to study nutrition, the effects of certain nutritional components on organs, mostly liver, and as well as some research on certain chemicals in green teas with regard to cancer.
Yeah, fascinating. So you are a therapist, but you also really understand the brain part of this and neuroscience and our brain's response to addictive substances, right?
Yes, I do. I do understand it to the extent that it is understood, I think. And I'm sure there's a lot more known than what I know, but I think we'd all be surprised at how little we do know. But the field of neuroscience itself is only about 30 years old. So just the idea that, we have neurons that are continuing to grow, until we die. We still replace neurons. We used to think that wasn't the case. And we were able to sort of, retrain neurons and change the way we behave based on this sort of retraining. I taught a class at Rutgers called Drugs and Human Behavior. It was one of my favorite classes to teach because it was essentially all levels of college students, and they were so engaged in what happens, and they loved hearing about the idea of addiction from a neuroscience perspective. So the idea that someone's neurons or genetics, environment, whatever, could sort of lead to taking or ingesting a drug and responding to it in a different way than maybe their peers did. And they were fascinated by that. And I was fascinated by their fascination, just the openness of it, the openness of the students to the idea that all behavior originates in the brain and how brain differences resulting from genetics or environment can affect the way they respond to drugs and whether or not they become addicted.
Yeah, fascinating. And it gets me to the next question, and that is, there is a brain part of this that we can tend to be addicts. I have an addict brain, as we call it, and then I had an environment that set me up for responding to some trauma that led to my use of alcohol and food. So, talk about genetic versus environmental, and both. How they both influence us becoming addicted.
Right. And I think most of us most of us who have personal experience with addiction, have an idea that there's a genetic component, right? And of course, science does confirm this. We haven't specifically found a gene that indicates you're going to become addicted, right? I mean, genes are just part of the equation. Genes can be turned on and turned off, or so they're not necessarily going to be activated. Not always, but pretty much always. There needs to be an environmental component. But we do have specific genetic tendencies resulting from groups of genes that turn on or don't, that would make it more likely that we become addicted to, in some cases, a specific substance or any substance or behavior that would be addictive in human populations. And it's not just that, it's also we can have a predisposition to anxiety or depression, which makes it more likely that we will engage in addictive behaviors.
Right. Yeah, it's a fascinating study. And I know in a lot of your papers that I read, you use, which my son at Michigan State, he's working on a PhD in a similar field, studies a lot of mice. You have a lot of mice, right? To prove scientifically that they're responding to this or that. I read your caffeine paper, so talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, we looked at studies where this is a lot of basic science just to determine whether we can create animal models for certain human behaviors, right? And of course, I'm the first to acknowledge that it's a big leap to go from mice to human behavior. But the information is useful just to be able to show, for example, that some genetic knockouts, so mice who might be missing a certain gene are predisposed to some disease, or some protection from some disease, right? So even if we're not able to directly positively link human behavior with mouse behavior, we can demonstrate that, at least in mice, and I think it's safe to assume in humans and any animal that has genes, that when you remove a certain gene when you remove a certain gene, you render the animal more either vulnerable or protected to another disease. With the caffeine research, what we looked at genetic knockouts. This is a pretty obvious genetic knockout, but we looked at mice that don't grow hair, right? So they have no protection against UV light, right? So that's a genetic knockout for growing hair. So they're naturally more likely to experience things like skin cancers. Caffeine in those studies, caffeine was protective against skin cancers. Yeah.
That's good to know. I do like my caffeine. Yeah, it's fascinating. We're going to get into some talk about alcohol and drugs and food and trauma. Um, and I think it's interesting too. I didn't realize that you had children already before you went for your advanced degree. Is that right?
Yes, two of my three children were already kids.
Oh,
they, were,
gosh.
they were already
Wow.
around. Yeah, it was a handful.
That is a, yeah, that is, yeah, that's a busy life. That's a very busy life. But you decided that's what you wanted to do. And I'm sure your husband supported you. And so, yeah, it's really cool. Um, let's talk about this. You told me it was okay to bring this up. Do you have personal experience with addiction and recovery in your life?
Absolutely, yes. So my family is sort of entrenched in the world of addiction. We have, those of us who are familiar with the language of alcoholism. I have a family of one and dones. So we have a number of people in our family who are in recovery. They either went into rehab or didn't, but discovered that alcohol. We certainly have whatever gene predisposes us to alcohol addiction. I have a total of 7 siblings, so there were 8 of us, and most of them did a month in rehab, and were able to attain long-term sobriety, and that includes me. And so I've been sober for many years. We have my father struggled with it. It eventually. It was his demise, and lots of people on my father's side of the family as well. So it was rampant in my family. We were very familiar with alcohol addiction. It seemed in our family, if you drank, you were more likely than not to develop an addiction to alcohol. What's interesting to me is that later, once we discovered this, once I started really looking into food addiction, I also discovered that most of my family also struggled with food addiction. We didn't really know that, I don't think, because we're all very active. So there wasn't a lot of overweight or obesity. We didn't recognize that. But of course, you can have a food addiction without being overweight or obese. And I think most of us certainly have grappled with that. And that was likely my first addiction.
Yeah, I had it in my family too. I am a recovered alcoholic. I'm a recovered food addict, and my father was both. He was an alcoholic and food addict. He was like me, tried to use diets for years. He tried to stop drinking for a while, but always went back. And then my mother had brothers that were alcoholic, and her father was. So it was just everywhere. And, drinking was just part of our family. But it can get out of control. We're going to talk about that. Recognizing that this is another addiction, just like food. I used food to get sober, and it worked. I got sober, but then I really had to hit the other addiction, and that's what happens. I'm sure you've seen it in your practice.
I see it so often in my practice. Absolutely, it's almost more often than not.
Yeah, I bet. Well, let's start by talking about your work with alcohol and drugs. You had a group of women struggling with alcohol use, and part of your promotion of this group is for women struggling with alcohol use. We use an evidence-based approach to identify and process trauma and other issues that might get in the way of recovery. Just talk about your groups that you do, and then the individual therapy for alcohol use or drug use.
Yes. So over the years, I've had many groups. Some were mixed gender, some were women's groups, some are men's groups, dealing with different co-occurring issues such as anger and alcohol, food addiction and alcohol, trauma and alcohol, trauma and food addiction. It is my opinion, and I know that this is not an absolute, and it's certainly not everyone's opinion, but it is my opinion that all addiction involves some trauma. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's something that's going to appear on the list of adverse childhood events as a sort of recognized trauma. I'm a big subscriber to, I don't know if you've heard Gabor Mate's description of trauma and the idea of being born.
I've read his book, yes.
Yeah, so born with
and I saw your reference to him. So we're going to talk about that. He specializes in trauma. I read his his book. I follow him. He's fascinating, and he's an addict himself, a recovered addict.
Yes, absolutely. And I feel like so much of what he says comes from his, some decades of work with people who struggle with addiction.
Yeah, he's Gabor Mate, Gabor Mate, and then the E is pronounced A, Mate. He was in the sort of the bowels of the homeless area of Canada, as I remember from the book.
Yes, in Vancouver.
And treating people with addiction. And he talks about his addiction to odd addiction, I thought, but he collected, I think, CDs. Right?
Yes, classical music CDs. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Classical music CDs. So addiction can take many different forms, okay? It can be behaviors, it can be spending, it could be gambling. That was his. So it's a fascinating story. But we're going to talk about trauma, big T, little t, and your view on that. But talk about what you learned, what you have learned in your practice about people, women or men, struggling with alcohol and drug use. You say that trauma is part of it. Every addiction. What are the big things that you've learned from that in terms of what they come to you with? And then we'll talk about recovery.
So many things that I've learned. It would be difficult to pin one down, but there are a few things that really seem to present themselves in every case, right? So I have, I rarely meet a person who is quick to acknowledge their trauma, right? So generally speaking, people are downplaying their trauma, even when they would appear on, the adverse childhood events. I had a client who scored a 7 on that and, came in saying their trauma was, not as bad as others. So that's not the reason for their addiction, right? So, but even without the adverse childhood events, without the obvious ones, there's in some cases an environment of scarcity without necessarily recognition of that, right? So you can have someone who has a food addiction who grew up in, what we would call a middle-class home with plenty of food, but maybe a parent who was really, really strict about food, right? To the point where it became an obsession, right? So there's a scarcity mindset there, even though it isn't technically what might be defined as a scarcity household, right? Because there's plenty of income. But the person that I'm thinking of certainly suffered from food addiction, and this was part of it for sure. And once they overcame the scarcity mindset and recognized that it wasn't something they had to deal with, it made it much clearer for them. So there are a couple of, so those, people are not quick to recognize their trauma. The other thing that I've noticed in treating addiction is that we do much better when we have what is called an internal locus of control, as opposed to an external locus of control, right? So when I have a client that comes in and starts to tell me all of the things that everyone else is doing to them and all the reasons that they can't possibly do what I'm asking of them or what they're asking of themselves because of so-and-so is doing this, or they don't make enough money, so an external, meaning it's everyone else's fault. And to me, addiction is not about fault at all. It's about recognizing where you might have control and where you actually may not. The Serenity Prayer, whatever you think about the 12 steps, the Serenity Prayer is an apt prayer, right? Recognize what you have control over. So it is my experience for all these years of doing this. It's my experience that when people, even if they don't come in with an internal locus of control, when they begin to develop one, the work progresses much more quickly, exponentially more quickly. So those are a couple things I look for. I look at identifying what their trauma might be and helping them heal from that if they're willing. And I use a variety of methods. I use cognitive processing for trauma. I use EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And, a lot of just talking it out and helping them understand, that things may have had a role in their trauma, but are not necessarily responsible for it. There's a lot of that kind of, and then of course, helping them understand, wait a minute, you do have more control than you think over some aspects of your life.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you said a lot in all of that. And since you and I have been through 12-step recovery, we know that, the alcohol and food wasn't really the problem so much as it was the solution for us.
Absolutely.
Alcohol and food was the solution to me in terms of the anger, sadness, depression, whatever it was. That was the solution. And then we say in meetings sometimes, there are one of the 3 L's will get you in the rooms: your liver, your lover, or the law. So when people come for help, you can use that if you want.
I will.
One of those brings us there because somebody coming to you has probably had one of those things. Their lover, the law, you've got a DUI, or their health is deteriorating. So those are the things. And if you come in not quite ready, if you're in denial, if you don't have the willingness, you're just like, hey, get me sober because my husband's complaining. And I've heard in meetings, if you had my husband, you'd drink too. We need to find the causes and conditions of this, right? Why, we were using those and they were self-destructive behaviors using these substances. And then we get to the causes and conditions, right? We figure out, hey, it's not them, it's how I'm responding to what's going on, right?
Absolutely. That's exactly right. When I'm in treatment with clients, I often refer to alcohol or food as a blunt instrument, right? This is something that's going to take care of everything very quickly, whatever it is you're dealing with, so quickly, and to the extent that you might not even have recognized what you were dealing with when you took that blunt instrument to it, right? Your brain just really figures out, okay, this is something that works quickly, we're going to take care of it. So identifying what it is, as you said, that you're perceiving, the way you're perceiving your problem, what is it, And is there a better way? And there's always a better way, of course. Is there a better way to handle what you're perceiving, to even change maybe what you're perceiving?
Right. Yeah. And I'm sure that's what you do in your work. Denial's very powerful. I didn't think I drank alcoholically for many years. I didn't think 203 pounds that I had a problem with food, although I had all the negative consequences, health problems. My family was worried. I kept having to buy new clothes. And now I've been 70 pounds down for almost 8 years using recovery. Yeah, I don't eat sugar. And so another addiction kind of each day I work at it,
Yeah. Congratulations. That's fantastic.
Thanks. I feel very good. Let's talk about trauma. We call these adverse childhood experiences. I read some of your stuff about this. You said some of the experiences in childhood trauma are bigger than others. I think this is me saying this, but when we think of childhood trauma, we think of sexual abuse, physical abuse, some of the more abhorrent, adverse childhood experiences. And I think for many years, in one of your places on the website, you had Gabor Mate talking to another fellow who had been bullied, and when he was bullied, he was not supported by his parents. In other words, they weren't acknowledging it. And those are the subtle trauma experiences. And I had some of my childhood where we're like, well, I had a roof over my head. I had food. We went on vacations. And it's like, that's not what we're talking about. Talk about trauma that can occur in childhood that we may not recognize as a trauma.
Right. Thanks. And this is an example of the combination between nature and nurture, the combination between genetics and environment, right? So some people are born sensitive. And I want to be very clear about that. I did not say too sensitive. There is not such a thing as too sensitive, right? So we have a scale of sensitivity. Some people are what we would call very thick-skinned, and some people are sensitive, and many people fall in between there. But there is no such thing as too sensitive. You're as sensitive as you are, right? So you just need to learn to cope with how sensitive you are, and maybe sort of choose your experiences based on that, maybe even the people that you're with based on that, right? It helps to recognize that. But people who are very sensitive are often criticized as being too sensitive, right? And these are the same people that will come to me and say they didn't have much trauma and they can't figure out what's up. But they may have had an experience that, a less sensitive person would have been able to brush off. And, our culture would tell them they should brush it off. But you don't really have a lot of control over that, especially as a child. If it hurts, it hurts. And sometimes it hurts really deeply, right? Some children can handle being bullied. And I mean that in the sense that their home life is so solid and supportive, and their nature is resilient, so that if they get bullied, it eventually they metabolize it quickly, right? There are some kids who maybe, as I said, are born more sensitive, and they just are. And maybe in addition to that, their home life is maybe not terribly, unsupportive, but maybe not super supportive, right? You may have parents who are of the mindset that you should brush you, or maybe parents who think you got to toughen up and they don't want to contribute to any, over mollifying you. So they're going to have you tough it out and assume that's going to work. And in the case that I was talking about, this person did over time developed an alcohol problem from that may have in part resulted from the bullying he experienced as a child. There are just dozens and dozens of cases where people are, they struggle to identify their trauma. But when they do, it's incredibly freeing. It isn't that they blame everything on that. It's that, first, to hear that they're not too sensitive is something that seems to make people really happy. that there is, there's a space where they're allowed to be.
I'm happy.
Right?
Yeah.
There's a space where they're allowed to be as sensitive as they are, and even celebrated for their sensitivity. I mean, what would the world be without sensitive people, right, Susan? Like, I wouldn't want to live in a world that didn't have sensitive people.
Sure.
Where would all our
No, it's a curse and a blessing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's a curse and a blessing. And I was born, I often say a little too sensitive, but that's the way my parents looked at it, that I just needed to work harder, suck it up. Why are you crying? What's wrong with you? And that's the trauma that I faced, is that nobody really understood why I was crying all the time, why I was anxious, why I didn't understand it. But it is a source of trauma that I'm sure that generalized anxiety disorder I had and still have, I used alcohol and food to assuage.
Sure. So in addition to whatever traumas were making you feel sad, you also felt shame over how you were handling it, right? And thinking there was something wrong.
Yeah, and I looked at kids that maybe were more thick-skinned than me, and they were coping pretty well.
Yeah, or
I just didn't seem to be. I didn't know what was going on with them, but they seemed to be doing quite well. You say in one of your posts, victims of trauma may experience intense emotions like anxiety, rage, or sadness. They may struggle to find suitable ways to express these emotions or comfort themselves. Often trauma survivors drink excessively. They may have sex addiction with numerous partners despite negative consequences. They may eat too much, too often, and they may engage of some form or version of all of the above. So we respond to that sort of like little beehive in the chest of trauma, and it comes out as anxiety, rage, or sadness, depression, perhaps. Talk about that.
Yeah, it comes out as anxiety, rage, or sadness. And, I do find that there's and this is not news, but there does appear to be a gender difference there. So more often with men, it appears as anger, irritability. Many male clients have come to me with anger issues, only to find that there's, of course, an anxiety disorder in there, or an anxiety issue combined with alcohol. But, Terrence Reel's book from, I believe, 1997, I Don't Want to Talk About It, is a great source of information for me because he talks specifically about men and depression and the way they handle depression and depression resulting from trauma or whatever. But yeah, so people do express their discomfort in a lot of different ways. And, so much of reaching for those behaviors, like, everything from porn to food, alcohol, whatever it is, gambling, it's really just about just trying to feel better. We're all just trying to feel better. That's really what it all is. We have this dopamine mechanism that we've evolved, and we need it. It's important. We wouldn't have survived without it, but it gets hijacked because of this intense desire to feel better. And it isn't that people are weak. It's not that they are oversensitive. It's, their pain feels like too much for them. It feels to like, it feels like we can't handle it. Like it's too much. We need assistance from some blunt instrument.
Right. And the alcohol and food, in my case, and I see in other cases, it's a way to sort of numb out and to escape from those highly anxious feelings. And over time, we need more alcohol and food to feel the same way. And then late stage food addicts, I know you've learned this, that at some point we eat because we have to, and we don't want to experience the withdrawal of not drinking or not eating, right?
Yes, yes. What I always like to, if you don't mind, Susan, what I always like to emphasize with, with tolerance, which is what you described. So tolerance is needing more and more of a substance in order to achieve the same effect, and then eventually having to consume that substance to avoid the pain of withdrawal, right? So at first it may start as pursuit of pleasure, and then it becomes essentially avoidance of pain, right? What I always like to emphasize that people find surprising is that tolerance is a result of brain chemistry, right? So there's been a change in neurons, and I'm sure you've covered this on the show many times. I know you've had people on that have talked about this. But what happens essentially is the brain downregulates dopamine receptors, right? So it makes it so that the dopamine response is not so intense. The brain wants to stay in homeostasis, right? It wants to stay the same. So if you're continually feeding, say, highly palatable foods or alcohol or cocaine or any of the other dopamine-inducing behaviors or substances, the brain will regulate by downregulating dopamine receptors. What I want to say about this that's really important for people to understand is that is a temporary and reversible condition, right? The brain is also able to upregulate the dopamine receptors. So there's actually a process of physical healing. And this was something that people in my classes and in my groups seem to be most fascinated by. The fact that the brain can adapt, can actually become what we might call healthy, right? After periods of abstinence or behaviors that don't necessarily involve the increased expression of dopamine all the time. Right? So it is reversible. These are receptors. Receptors are different from nerves and neurons, right? We're not destroying nerves and neurons necessarily. We are downregulating these little protein clusters called receptors. They can grow back.
Yeah, and I'm a personal example of that. I mean, I had to go through, and we're going to get into food, but with alcohol, I had to stop drinking, and there were cravings. I had to get through cravings, which was, the brain chemistry saying, you got to drink this, you got to do this to not feel, feel the withdrawal effects. And the same thing with sugar. I had to go through about 3 weeks of intense cravings, and it's tough withdrawing from the foods that you're used to eating. And my blood pressure went down so low, I was taking 2 blood pressure medications because I was obese. And when I started to be healthy, my doctor said, get off them. And I've been off them for 8 years now. And so your body sort of does this whole reset thing, where, but you have to get through, you have to know that the craving period, the withdrawal period will stop at some point. And your body is a miracle to sort of reset, right?
Yes. Then that's so much of the issue is you have to get through that. The only way out is through. So people first, when people come to me, they think I'm going to tell them they have to give up their alcohol or their drug immediately. And that's not exactly how it works, right? The way that it works is first we help you understand that you can handle it. You can handle what comes along. Just the idea that you don't actually have to drink or eat highly palatable foods or sugar or whatever it is, you actually can get through these feelings, and that it's going to take a little practice for them to get to the point where they can do that. But that's the big lesson, leaning, my clients laugh at me because I'm always telling them, lean into the discomfort. My favorite word, discomfort.
And it's not going to kill you. That's the thing we think is that, oh, this is going to be a rabbit hole. I'm never going to get out of this depression or facing these feelings. It is possible to do it. And I've been through years of therapy, and it was very helpful to me. So it's been a long journey of therapy, recovery, and things to get to 66 years old. And, it took me a while, but I got here one day at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let's dive into the food. You graduated from Esther Helga's In Fact School. Esther Helga Goodman-Zotier owns this podcast. She and I have been collaborating as I host guests, and so I know that 3 or 4 years ago you graduated from the In Fact School, which is incredible. And you did what I have said to Esther: you need to market to the people that are treating alcohol and drugs, because food addiction is a big part of this. So talk about your work here in this area, food addiction.
Yeah, that course was so really life altering for me, because I have to be honest, I've been working, on the sort of the front lines of the opioid epidemic for, over a decade now. And I've been, seeing people die and seeing that the horrendous cost of this addiction. And I took the food addiction course really as a sort of something I could add on to my, list of services I could offer. I, at the time, didn't really know that much. Of course, I had taught physiological psychology, so I had taught the mechanism of food addiction, but from a very academic work. I taught Eric Stice's work, but from a very academic point of view. I think that I didn't really understand the impact of food addiction until I took that course. There were I had some classmates that had been severely food addicted, and the stories I heard brought me to tears. Like I really started to understand this is a real disease, and this is something that needs to be taken seriously. Of course, I understood it from a public health standpoint. You can't not pay attention to that. Of course, we understand that, the cost of the obesity epidemic, let's say, separate epidemic, but of course we understand that, right? But to see the personal stories and how it rips lives apart and just devastates people, and I really shifted my perspective during that class. It went from something I could add on to something I wanted to specialize in, to something I really wanted to help. I wanted, as much as I wanted to help with people addicted to opioids, with people addicted to alcohol, this was just right up there with all of those. And I'm as passionate about treating food addiction as I am about opioid addiction and alcohol addiction. And of course, I began to identify my own food addiction during that class.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You're a recovered alcoholic, you said years ago. So how did you identify your own addiction to food?
I mean, you start, I guess some people would call it med school disease. You're doing a class and they start to list the symptoms and you're like, oh, I do that. I have that. Right. So, in fact, I took the Yale Food Addiction Scale, and found that I did have moderate food addiction, and in conversations with my sister, I'm very close with my sister, and we talked a lot about it, and we sort of recognized that we did come from an environment of scarcity for sure. There was trauma in my childhood that we certainly could identify, and I already knew that from the alcohol addiction, right? But we would recognize that the family of my family of kids and my family of origin, when we went to, say, a party, my siblings and I were clustered around the chip bowl and everybody else was out playing, right? We're all looking for whatever we can eat. We want to know when the next course is coming out. And we didn't know that that's not typical behavior for children. We didn't realize that, kids are out playing. I didn't know until I had my own children who I couldn't get to eat at a party that our behavior was atypical, or it was might be symptomatic of a bigger issue, right? And likely my parents struggled with it too. But we started to identify it. We all exercise really hard. I'm a runner. I ran marathons, so I didn't have I was always struggling with the same 10 pounds, but I was eating all the time. And food was the solution for everything.
Yeah. And over exercising and bulimia, anorexia, they're eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, they are recognized in the APA's DSM as eating disorders. We'll talk about food as a substance use disorder, but in our disease of food addiction, over exercising so we can eat more, is a thing. And, compulsive food behaviors, you can have people in a food recovery program who have 10 pounds maybe to lose, or perhaps they're underweight. they use food in unhealthy ways. They're obsessed with it, even if it's like in a scarcity restrictive mode, right?
Yes, absolutely. I noticed this in members of my family, and engaged in that behavior as well. I think what I probably dismissed as typical teenager behavior, but my eating was certainly disordered as a teenager, and my weight would fluctuate wildly. And I know that other members of my family struggled with that as well, restrictive eating patterns.
Yeah. Yeah, I did it. I would eat like oranges for 2 weeks so I could fit in my prom dress, and I'd hide food in my room. I mean, all that stuff.
Oh, yeah, smoking cigarettes so you wouldn't eat as much. Yeah.
Yes, I did that. Yep. I did that. Yeah. Well, the InFact School, just to tell our listeners that might be food addicts that want to know more, or that are counselors, social workers that specialize maybe in alcohol or drug addiction, recovery therapy, whatnot. infactschool.com is the website. And Esther Helga has classes coming up in March and September of next year. It's an incredible program.
It really
so
is.
I know you agree.
Yes.
Yeah. I know I saw on your Facebook post, or perhaps it was Instagram, that you had a group of, I don't know if it was women, January 2023, food addicts, group therapy. Talk about your group therapy, that class, and how, what, kind of what happened there, of course, with anonymity and so forth. I'd like to hear what happened.
Yeah, that was an 8-week program. It was a closed group. So essentially it starts with the same group of people that it ends with. And it was a sort of planned program wherein we would address different aspects of food addiction. So I first had sort of a pre-screening call to make sure that people were actually struggling with food addiction, and of course, most of the time when they called, they were. But so we identified sort of what stage they might be at using the Yale Food Addiction Scale, and then started to actually explore what I've identified as a lot of the issues, and of course based on research, right? So we did segments on trauma. We talked about, first there was a little lecture piece where I would explain how trauma affects the brain and how people sort of respond to trauma, often identifying big T and little t trauma as all viable. We do talk about this idea of being told you're too sensitive, and every single person in the group had been told they were too sensitive, right? And that's pretty much universal. And, when I'm treating people with substance use issues, they all say that at some point they've been told they were too sensitive. And interestingly, in some cases, especially with people with anger management, they also call people too sensitive very often, right? Which is also interesting. So if we stop one behavior, we stop that behavior. You're not allowed to call anybody too sensitive anymore. So yeah, we talked about people's response to trauma. And, in a few cases, there were situations where people could say, well, obviously, there was some really serious, like, and I hate to use that word serious because it's all serious, but there was something that maybe would be on that ACEs measure, right?
When you say ACEs measure, I saw that in your stuff.
Yeah. Adverse childhood events.
I see. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I see. Mm-hmm.
So, we had things that would appear on that. So they're sort of universally accepted traumas. I mean, and then we have lots of situations where people had what you might call little t trauma, just so that they understand there are different types of trauma. Every bit is serious and has, effects on them. So, we had people who lost a parent at the age, during late adolescence, and that might not appear on the ACEs scale, but how it affected their lives is very different from how it might affect someone else's life, right? We have a lot of situations with women where there's some kind of sexual trauma, but they have not acknowledged that it was not consensual, right? So they haven't sort of nailed that down for themselves.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of shame involved there. Different situations like that. So we address trauma, and we get to the point where everyone sort of recognizes that there were hurts, and those hurts are still sort of working their way through them, right? So that those things might need to be processed. And there was one or two groups where we actually sort of opened it up for processing. So if people wanted to talk, we would talk about what was going on with them and how it might affect them. And those were often tearful, sometimes joyful experiences, where people would say, I never really acknowledged that, or I never really understood what effect that had on me, even though it keeps occurring to me. I never realized it had an effect on my behavior. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's big. This is before I realized how bad my food situation was. I attended a group in Cincinnati for years, group therapy, individual therapy for food abuse, and it was called Acoria. And we talked, about food. We talked about our lives in group. We recorded our food. I was pretty good about recording my food, even though it might have been a binge or, eating sugar or whatever. What was the process of group therapy along with individual therapy? And were they eating what we call abstinently during this therapy time? Or what was that like?
We didn't actually get into changing diets too much formally until toward the end of the group, right? So what I did was what actually Esther Helga does in the class. So what I did was I gave them, taking into account any special dietary issues, I gave them the gray sheet. And I said, this is sort of the abstinent diet. I want you to play with it. I want you to see, how do you do on the gray sheet? And the gray sheet diet is essentially 3 meals. There's a protein, and then there's, a large amount of fruit and vegetables, which is, often a challenge for people, as you know. A large amount of fruit and vegetables, but it includes all the food groups. It includes carbs. It includes, proteins. And vegetables as well. So I introduced the gray sheet as a concept sort of early on. And then at one point, as Esther Helga did, we say, okay, is this the week we're going to do this? Now, what I always say is the same thing I say to clients. I'm not telling you you have to do this. What I'm telling you is this is our goal this week. And if it's challenging to you, that's fine. That's okay. If you end up eating whatever you end up eating, that's okay. But what I need you to do before you eat it, or make it, or whatever it is, I just need you to just journal what you're going through. I need you to tell me what's coming up for you. What are you feeling like? If you feel like I can't do this, write that. Tell me what it is that you can't do, right? So very often what happens there, this is not a trick, it really isn't. But often what happens there is somebody will start to journal it, and they'll write, I've had it happen where they'll write a lot, and then the craving sort of passes. It's not a trick. But they start to recognize that they've been telling themselves that they can't do it. And in fact, they have just done it for 10 minutes. They've gotten through it. And sometimes that happens. So if that's not what happens, if they end up eating or drinking in other cases, whatever it is, then we say, okay, well, this is what you came up with before you started to drink. And if they don't get to it before, I ask them to do it after. See if you can remember what it was you were going through. And then we dispute the assertion that they can't take it. And I say, okay, you say here that you can't take that. Is that real? Is that a helpful belief? Is that actually, are there alternative beliefs that we could play with? Obviously this ABC, the activating event, the belief about the event, and the consequence. So we go through all that. We dispute what we might call the irrational belief and see if next time they can handle it. What happens in the food addiction groups is sometimes we have really dramatic changes and sometimes we have small changes. But I've never had a situation where there was no change. There are anything from, okay, this person went through the whole group, learned a lot about themselves, and gave up M&Ms. Awesome, whatever. That's progress. And that's something you can take along. And maybe that's all that person needed. Right? I don't know. We talk a lot about mindful eating, Susan. I know you're very familiar with that. So we talk a lot about enjoying your food, looking at eating as a beautiful, nourishing experience. This is, again, something Esther Helga sort of taught us. And I worked with another woman, Ella Majors, when I discovered my own food addiction. I am vegan. I know that's going to be controversial for some people, but I This is something that works for me, and it works in my food addiction. There are lots of examples of people who can do this. I never tell other people that that's what they need to do. I always introduce the gray sheet as it is, right? But this woman, Ella Majors, works with vegans, and we worked on mindful eating. So enjoying the food experience. Food is delicious. Fruit is delicious, right? Fruit really becomes delicious after you stop eating chocolate cake. But really enjoying it, chewing your food to a pulp, spending time on food, making it a nice experience. Again, Esther Helga emphasized that. She talked about recipes that she loves, right? And we talk about that. Of course, you're eating to live. That's the goal, as opposed to living to eat. But you're really enjoying the experience. And this is something that is surprising to people very often, that you can change your diet radically and find that you're actually enjoying your food more. Because that's another thing that we talk about a lot. That binge you just had. Tell me how much you enjoyed it. Did you really enjoy it? Right? So.
Yeah, eating a lot, eating it fast so you don't get full. I mean, doing it secretly. These are all, unhealthy food behaviors. And the abstinent food plan I've been on for now almost 8 years is full of vegetables and fats. Fat doesn't make you fat. They're good for you. You need them. And a little bit of carbs. I have some carbs. I have fruit, vegetables. I have a lot of protein. So I look forward to my meals. I'm hungry before my meal. I eat my meal, and it's really cool recovery. And on the InFact School website, there are programs of recovery. And the group you talked about, it can be really powerful to have other people support you. It's like, I'm going through this too. And I'm sure the group got close over 8 weeks, and we're able to support each other. There's something that goes on there. And then journaling. It's a big part of my recovery, is just journaling, figuring out what's going on in my head and putting it on paper. Just the writing about it, realizing that, yes, I feel this, it will pass. How do I deal with it now? Which does not involve food or alcohol, right?
Mine too. That's an important part of my recovery. I'm journaling all the time. Some days I have 3 or 4 journal entries. Yeah, it's really, really helpful.
Yeah. So as we kind of wrap up here, a couple more things. So this group was in 2023. We're coming up on 2 years from then. Have you tracked? Yeah, I know it doesn't seem possible, but do you track their progress and how they've healed, how they've recovered?
Yeah, I do, and we all stay in touch. And some have achieved really lasting, what you would call, I guess, full recovery, to the point where their eating is completely healthy, or as completely healthy as it can be. And by completely healthy, in my opinion, I'm looking at 80-20, right? That 80-20 rule. If 80% of the time you're doing what's healthy for you, then great. We do identify for every group, we identify certain trigger foods, and some people do have certain trigger foods that they really need to avoid, right? And for the most part, I would say that the trigger food that seems to be most common are candy. That appears to be the most common thing, especially, chocolate candy or something like that. Definitely something I need to stay away from. But other than that, people enjoy their food, and it isn't just that they're enjoying their food more, they're enjoying their lives more, right? This idea that they have control, that they can handle adversity, they can handle conflict. One of the things that people learn early on that's so interesting to me is they learn they can be in a room where there's conflict, and they don't have to take it on themselves, right? They don't have to solve it. So just what people learn about themselves is so interesting to me. And always there's some degree of improvement, and in some cases it's pretty dramatic.
So I know you agree that food as a substance is a substance use disorder, and there's a brain chemistry here. It sounds like some of the efforts that you've made in your practice is to have group therapy. I'm sure individual therapy. I assume you agree with the 12-step recovery approach as well, right? And along with that, you talk about that in the groups and individual.
I believe that 12 steps is helpful to many people. The 12-step programs are helpful to many people. Many people benefit from 12-step programs. I think there are a variety of programs. Recovery is individual, and I support whatever program people go on, as long as it's in line with evidence, right? not just another food restriction idea, but that it's actually a recovery program. And like I said, I think the 12-step programs have helped lots of people.
Yeah, we had Dr. John Kelly on this podcast, and he did a study on alcohol. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but do 12-step recovery programs work? And with alcohol, he proved with a large group that it does. And the meetings and fellowship and so forth and everything that goes on, people have recovered and it's worked. So, but there are other things out there, therapy, other programs which are not 12-step. Some people object or have reluctance to go into 12-step recovery because of the spiritual aspect, the God thing, as people say. But there are ways to consider what is your higher power that doesn't involve the traditional God, as we know. So let's... I'm sure you agree that one of the goals of the Food Addiction Institute is to get substance use disorder and food as a substance use disorder in the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-5, right? You agree with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with that. I think it's urgent. It's very important and it's very urgent. We need to have this treatment. If anything, just because we're so reliant on insurance for treatment, people can't afford psychotherapy without insurance. And if it's not covered, they can't do it. And there are serious consequences to that.
Yeah. There's some big things afoot with RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr. coming in, putting the focus on big food, big pharma. The application is moving forward with the DSM-5. So last question for you. What would you say to someone out there who might be listening and struggling with their food use? Can't stop once they start. Perhaps they're obese. They have obesity-related illnesses, maybe not. But what would you say to that person?
I would say that you're kind of telling yourself that you can't, and you may not even recognize that you're telling yourself that you can't, but we could identify that. I would say get help. People can change and life can be better, and you deserve to be free of this. You deserve to have some joy in your life, and you absolutely can do it. I mean, there have been many people who were at end stage, it seemed, and have turned it around. And there are ways to help. There are ways to fix it. It's not a character issue. It's an illness. It has something to do with, of course, the way food is marketed, and we can absolutely help. And I would say get help. Don't give up.
Don't give up. Just like the opioid situation you faced in your community, it's like, food addiction is real. And I have a vision board behind me. You can see I did it in 2008, and everything's come true mostly because of recovery. Living this life, not drinking and not eating too much.
That's a great point, Susan. It isn't just that the food addiction gets better; it's that life gets better. When you give up a substance, the tools that you use to give up that substance are so useful in so many other areas of your life. Your life just gets better. I often say I'd rather hang out with a group of people in recovery than a group of normies. People in
Me
recovery.
too.
Yeah, they're just
Me too.
They just look at life in a way that's so exciting and they're promising, and you don't need to take a blunt instrument to your emotions.
No. This has been a great episode. Thanks, Bonnie. I love serving with you on the board, and I know you have a relationship with Esther Helga. She says you got to talk to Bonnie. So thanks for agreeing to do this, and thanks for being a guest.
Absolutely, my pleasure. The time's gone so fast. It's been great. Thank you so much, Susan.
This is the Food Addiction Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the podcast and learned more about this disease. We hope you will rate and write a review on this podcast and share it with others. If you or someone you know is suffering from the disease of food addiction, there is a solution. The various food addiction recovery programs are available and listed on the website, theinfactschool.com. Or if you would like to know more about how to get certified in treating food addiction, the school is accepting applications now for its next training beginning in September 2023. Go to theinfactschool.com. That's INFACT school.com to learn more.